Hey everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Carolyn Weiss, and I am the Executive Director of the Oceans Caucus Foundation. I hope everyone is enjoying these last days of summer as weird as it's been. Although COVID is still front and center in all of our lives and agendas, I'm looking forward to a brief break to continue the discussion on the importance of improving our waste management systems and consumption patterns. The Oceans Caucus Foundation has covered the topic of recycling and waste management a lot in this Congress, and I'm looking forward to engaging a different partner of ours, the Plant-Based Products Council, to discuss the possibility of new materials as part of the solution to some of the plastic and single-use packaging issues. If you've participated in any of our events on this topic in the past, you know that we believe the ocean plastic issue does not have a silver bullet solution. Plastics have a necessary role in our society and product stream, but there is a place for alternative materials and waste streams. Regardless if you are talking about plastic, paper, food waste, bio-based materials, etc., we are going to have to effectively manage it. Our panel today is going to help us navigate some of the greenwash terms that are always thrown around or used on packaging, lay out our current global waste management trends, break down what the circular economy actually entails, and give us an introduction into bioplastics and the role they could play in our society. A big thank you to our panelists and to Plant-Based Products Council for helping us organize this event today. I want us to get right into our panel discussion, but just a couple quick housekeeping points. All of you watching on our YouTube live page will see a chat box to the right of the video. Our moderated panel discussion will be taking questions from the audience. I'll be monitoring this chat and present any relevant questions to the panel. It's always helpful if you put your name and affiliation at the beginning of your question so the panelists know who they are talking to. I'm excited to have Chris Miller moderating our discussion today. As a partner at AJW and his long history on the Hill working on energy and environmental policy, he's going to be perfect in helping us navigate this topic. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thanks for having me here. I'm really glad to be here as a partner at AJW and a consultant to the Plant-Based Products Council. Prior to my time in the private sector, I spent about 27 years on the Hill, mostly on the Senate side. One of the very first things I worked on for John Glenn was a bill to increase federal procurement of plastics and products made from corn and renewable biomass. That was in 1988. Unfortunately, our performance as a nation since then with respect to dealing with plastic waste, solid waste, and closing the circle, as is really directed by our official national solid waste management policy and the law, has been pretty dismal. Instead, we've allowed a very linear economy to develop. That means we're sending vast resources to be buried in landfills and otherwise wasted. A lot of that causes landfills to be the third largest source of the potent greenhouse gas methane. This carelessness is part of a global phenomenon that has also contributed to the pervasive pollution of the oceans and our environment with plastic waste. Today's panel is going to give you some insights into the potential of plant-based materials and how they can help the economy more circular and tackle our serious waste challenge. I'm pleased to introduce our excellent panelists who will provide their perspectives and take questions and help all of us understand this important topic better. Hasso van Pogrel, who since 2009 has been the Managing Director of European Bioplastics, a trade association of manufacturers committed to driving the evolution of plastics. Allison Shapiro is an Executive Director at Closed Loop Partners, an investment firm and an innovation center focused on building circular economies around the world. She's worked at JP Morgan in structured finance, at Johnson Controls on EV battery commercialization, at PG&E on smart grid, and much more. And she has an MBA and an MS in sustainable systems from my alma mater, the University of Michigan. Dr. Evan White is from the University of Georgia, where he is an assistant research scientist and director of the Biosynergetic Laboratory at the university's New Materials Institute. He works closely with institute partners on developing compostable plastics. I want to take it over to Hasso, and each panelist will do a little more introduction of themselves, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Hasso van Pogrel. I'm the Managing Director of European Bioplastics. European Bioplastics is an association representing the interests of companies that are producing, converting, or altogether just using bioplastics in Europe. As to the definition of bioplastics, I guess we'll come to that in a few minutes, but maybe a few more words about the association. It was founded almost 30 years ago, initially to represent the interests of German producers of biodegradable applications, which is the reason why we're still based in Berlin, Germany. But around 15 years ago, we changed our name into European Bioplastics, and since then the focus is on the entire European market and not just Germany. Currently, we have around 75 members from all over the world and across the entire value chain. Apart from representing the interests of our members towards the EU institutions, our aim is to inform all interested stakeholders, including, of course, the policymakers in Brussels, about bioplastics, their benefits, their limitations, and, of course, also about the newest developments in this sector. The ultimate goal, of course, is to help create an environmental and legal landscape which, if possible, is favorable to bioplastics. So much for now. I'll pass back on to Chris.
Thanks, Hasso. Over to you, Allison.
Great. Thank you, Chris and Carolyn. Pleasure to be here. The first thing I will say is, despite my name tag in the bottom corner of the window, I'm not Eric Avney. That's a colleague. I'm Allison Shapiro from Closed Loop Partners. And as Chris mentioned, we are an investment and innovation firm for circular economy. We were founded in 2014. We're based in New York, and we operate 6 investment funds, all private market, exclusive to circular economy investments. Some are North America focused, some are global. And what we really want to try to achieve is raising and deploying capital in all aspects of the risk spectrum, from early stage venture capital to private debt to private equity, to find and scale businesses with transformational solutions, and also really fundamental basic building blocks of recycling systems too. On the innovation side, our Center for the Circular Economy does applied research, advisory, and pre-competitive collaboration for circular solutions. As an example, we are currently working with Starbucks, McDonald's, and IDEO to redesign the single-use coffee cup, which is fiber-based but plastic-lined, which makes it hard to recycle. And we just launched 2 months ago now, an effort with Target, Kroger, CVS, and Walmart to redesign the plastic bag, the single-use plastic bag. So we're trying to bring in non-investment grade solutions to market, and also for those that are investment grade, give them capital and a network to scale.
Thanks very much. Dr. White?
All right, thanks, Chris, for that introduction. And just as a brief introduction, my name is Evan White, and I'm a research scientist and a chemist at the University of Georgia New Materials Institute, which was founded in 2017. I have been working in polymer science now for 11 years, and with a close relationship to our industry partners. Our research efforts focus on developing mostly compostable single-use plastic packaging, primarily for food packaging, as most of the plastic packaging currently in use in the food value chain has significant barriers to recycling. Understanding how to make compostable, flexible packaging from plants and understanding how nature reclaims compostable materials is the forefront of our studies. Flexible packaging is often contaminated with all kinds of biological material, so I believe that compostable packaging provides an opportunity to reclaim the embodied energy of food waste and to produce healthy compost to grow more plants for a more circular economy. So I'll pass that back to Chris so we can get started. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Hasso lifted the curtain already. I think a lot of people don't really quite understand what bioplastics are, so anybody who wants to take that on, and also maybe talk a little bit about what can those bioplastics be made of and how do they compare to petroleum-based plastics, I think would be interesting. Hasso?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start with the definition that we in European Bioplastics are using, and which is being taken up in all of Europe, and it's being seen as the general definition. We say a bioplastic is a plastic which is either bio-based, biodegradable, or both. This is the very short and simple way of defining it, but of course you have to get a little bit closer to what it exactly means. So bio-based means it's made, at least in parts, from renewable materials, renewable raw materials. And biodegradable, this is where it becomes kind of more difficult. We normally, when we talk about biodegradable, we generally mean compostable in industrial composting facilities, because biodegradability is an overall description, because at the end of the day, everything is biodegradable. It may take a few million years to biodegrade eventually. So if you want to define biodegradability, you always have to define the environment and a time frame in which this biodegradation takes place. So when we, at least at European Bioplastics, talk about biodegradability without any additional information, we normally mean industrially compostable. There's all different kinds of biodegradation. You can have biodegradation in the marine environment, you can have biodegradation in soil, and all these have different attributes, they have different necessities for the biodegradation to take place. I think Evan probably knows even more about it, being a scientist on that.
Evan, if you please.
Yeah, well, maybe I can comment on that. So in the United States, we have ASTM standards that define these types of conditions that Hasso was bringing up, everything from marine to soil to industrial facilities to other more challenging environments. And effectively, it's the environment that dictates the outcome of these types of compostable materials. And to put another wrinkle of complexity into the definitions, compostable materials imply metabolism to the production of biogases, where biodegradation does not necessarily imply metabolism. So really the gold standard would be for these types of materials for consumer perception to be compostable. That way it's understood that those materials are supposed to be deconstructed on a chemical level by the organisms in those environments that are defined by the standards and actually operate in practice in these types of infrastructures, such as industrial composting.
Let's go big picture, but I want to go back to some of the issues you teed up there. But in general, how could bioplastics help us with the plastic waste that's plaguing our oceans, our environment, and apparently even in our bodies right now? How do we move them into everyday use? What's the role that they could play? Allison?
Sure.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll take that. So basically, when it comes to the mechanisms and the vectors for which plastic enters the oceans, most of that plastic enters the oceans from within 50 kilometers of the coastline, and this is by no coincidence where most of people on Earth live. So by making materials that are biodegradable and moreover compostable, the idea is that not only are you recapturing that carbon into a valuable product such as compost or soil amendments, you're also mitigating the amount of leakages that will wind up in the ocean. So it's a way to basically engineer a way for organisms to take apart those materials that will and do leak into the environment, whether it's in a relatively well-established managed waste stream like in the United States or in Europe, or in developing infrastructures where they don't have those waste stream collections.
Yeah, and I will say to kind of frame up a topic of a specific category of material, like a bioplastic. At Closed Loop Partners, we talk a lot about a concept of a circular economy, which differs from a linear economy in which most of us consume things today. Something is extracted from virgin resources, turned into a product, consumed likely once, and then disposed of in landfill, incineration, or deposition otherwise into a land and marine-based environment. That's not ideal. It's not ideal from a natural resources perspective. It's not ideal from an economic perspective. There's waste in both categories. You're not optimizing the economically useful life of the material, and you're depleting scarce resources. So in the hierarchy of circular economy that we believe in, that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation also espouses, is you try to reduce what you extract at the highest level. You reuse what you can, and you recycle and or biosource / compost what you can't. So in that hierarchy of framework, there are a couple of things that come first before you consider compostable solutions. But when you're in a category of compostable solutions, I think it's important to keep in mind that just as Evan alluded to and Haas alluded to, something that's bio-based, so it's bio-sourced and has the same physical properties as a fossil fuel-based derived plastic, isn't necessarily compostable. And even if it is compostable, there are a lot of lookalikes on the market that actually really confuse the recycling system. So we like to see the role of compostables that are bio-based, seaweed-based, corn-based PLA, for instance, be really clearly distinguishable to a consumer and to a recycling facility. It needs to be clearly labeled, it needs to be clearly different from a fossil fuel-based plastic, and that's kind of hard to achieve. So from an institutional view, we believe that the role of compostable packaging, while important, needs to be distinguished from what has economic value in a recycling stream. And you also have to consider, and Evan brought this up, if the material is actually a soil amendment. So does it enhance or regenerate the nutritional value of the soil such that it makes good compost? So it's kind of a couple steps down in the hierarchy, and then if you continue to thinking further, you need to think about whether it's actually adding value to the soil so that it's converted into a product like a compost or a biogas, which is actually useful.
If I may add something,
please, Hassel.
Maybe first I'd like to issue one important warning. I think we need to avoid the misconception that bioplastics could be a solution to littering. They're not. Plastics don't belong into the environment, period, no matter what. No matter how well they biodegrade in any kind of environment, they don't belong in there. It's just in some cases when you cannot avoid the plastic ending up, then biodegradability, in this case, soil biodegradability or marine biodegradability, can prove to be an asset. Maybe if I may, coming back to Allison's about the different hierarchies, I think composting is actually not on a lower level in the hierarchy than conventional recycling. It's just supposed to be a different end-of-life solution for specific applications. So it doesn't make sense to make every package biodegradable. It only makes sense, and that Evan touched upon that, on those which are prone to be contaminated with food or other bio-waste, which are not going to be recycled, which at best are going to be incinerated, at worst landfilled. This is where composting has a specific add-on benefit, and this is what we need to keep in mind. So I think distinguishing between mechanical recycling and organic recycling, which composting is not a matter of hierarchy, but of more of the different applications where it makes sense. But otherwise I would agree, reusing and recycling makes, of course, more sense and should be done as much as possible.
And also, I agree with you. I was more pointing out that reducing our consumption of virgin resources and reusing what we can come first before we think about making something recyclable or compostable.
Mm-hmm. For those of our audience that may not know what PLA is or ASTM, I would like to go back to the general terminologies that we're using, because I believe that consumers are already a little confused by the current recycling labels for petroleum plastics, whether it's a 1 or a 2 in that tiny little thing that's imprinted on the product, and differing solid waste management authorities accept different ones, and it's, I think, almost as confusing for at least the American consumer. European sounds like it system is a little more refined, it sounds like. What can we do? How do we avoid that kind of confusion when we're talking about using these new kinds of materials, so that we are, as doing Hasso, as what you said, we're channeling things in the right way and using them at their highest and best use? Anyone?
Well, maybe I can comment on that. So there are some examples of course, registered stamps or marks that are necessary to make certain claims around recycling or certain claims around composting for certain plastic packaging. However, one way that we can basically moderate this from a societal level is to make policy around how those claims are advertised in terms of colors, in terms of consumer expectations when they see a certain label and what that label means. And we all know this very well in terms of greenwashing and the use of the recycling logo as well as other logos that don't have those outcomes that consumers expect. So it's a good way to help normalize this is through consumer expectations of what certain colors and certain logos are supposed to mean.
If I may add, I think one problem is that indeed, especially in Europe, there's too many different logos around, and not all of them are really backed up by scientific proof, by certification. So there's a lot of logos where people just make some kind of self-proclaimed claim, and then they put that on their product, making it look like it's very green, very sustainable, but in many cases it isn't. So I think indeed it's very important to try to reduce the amount of labels on products, and those labels that are allowed to be on products need to be backed up by sound certification, which really proves that these are working the way they claim to be working.
Yeah, and I think outside of standardization and certification, which of course are important, the two other categories to think about are clear product design, so it's clear to the consumer what should be tossed in what bin. The other piece we haven't yet discussed is end-of-life infrastructure. So these materials have to get collected, and they have to get collected in a way that sends them to something other than an incinerator or a landfill or natural deposition. So that hauling of the material is important. And then they have to get processed. In the U.S., for context, we have about 200 industrial organic composting facilities, and only about half of them actually consistently accept compostable packaging. They really want your food waste and your yard waste. And in rare exceptions, they'll take kind of industrial biosolids. The degree to which they can accept compostable packaging depends on a couple of things, including what the nitrogen-carbon balance of the mixture they've already got together is, how much they can trust the hauler and the companies and entities that are sourcing the material to actually not give them a lot of lookalikes and screw up their operations. So I think the consideration of end-of-life infrastructure, having capital and permitting available to support the collection and processing, is also a huge piece of this, even if we can get the standards and certification and design right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I can kind of echo Allison's point about the regulations around establishing both recycling and composting facilities, it's really quite challenging for a company to establish either a recycling or composting facility within municipalities because of there's a number of good rules for why composting or recycling infrastructure can't be in certain locations. But when you add up all the different rules associated with those regulations, it really narrows down very, very small amounts of available land to actually establish these facilities. So even though there are economic opportunities for people to get into the recycling or into the composting game, they are often met with barriers from just a paperwork perspective.
Also, in Europe, there's really not much landfill capacity to speak of, right? Have you? What are your? What is Europe doing?
In Europe, of course, the population is living more densely than in many parts of the United States. But unfortunately, nonetheless, especially in the Eastern European countries, you still have a lot of landfill. In some countries like Romania, even up to 90% of all the plastic or the packaging waste is still being landfilled. So there is indeed room for improvement in all those countries. But in some countries like Germany, Italy, France, you have a very low rate of landfilling, which is good. In Germany, you have quite a high percentage going into incineration if it's not being recycled. Of course, that's not the best option, but it's still better than landfilling. And the thing is, you need to improve recycling, and I agree with Allison, the design at the end of the day of the packaging will make a big difference whether it can be and will be recycled. But I think we need to be clear about one thing. Already today, there's so much packaging in Europe that theoretically can be recycled mechanically, but it's not being recycled just because the design isn't really working, because it's too small, it's too tedious to separate it, to clean it, and then to recycle it. It's just not economically worthwhile. And especially with the low oil prices that we're facing right now, using recyclates instead of virgin material, there's very little incentive to do so. So you need to create a kind of environment, a legal environment or whatever, to create the incentives to use more recyclates, and in that way also to recycle more plastic, to make it economically more viable.
Allison, you referred to one of the in our pre-event conversation, we were talking a little bit about bans, and I know that I think the EU has explored the idea of taxes. I wonder if any of you have thoughts on whether those are the right way to go to develop a more circular economy and enhance the role that bioplastics might be able to play in that setting.
Yeah, I can speak to what we in Close Loop Partners have thought about, and admittedly, we are kind of new in our internal analysis of looking at the analog from the renewables sector, fuel economy sector, and looking for where tax credits versus the demand pull versus market push. Not to get too policy wonky here, but I can tell you some of the things we're thinking about, but we're still doing some of that research. I'd be curious to know what HASA thinks, but we definitely think that tax incentives and going through the U.S. tax code in the United States, since we're kind of talking to a U.S. Hill-based audience now, makes a lot of sense. Incentives to invest, incentives for research, also straight up cash grants. So Bioplastic doing a lot of testing on what makes a good soil additive, amendment to a compostable package to actually make it bioavailable, for instance. But tax incentives attract investment where public dollars aren't available. So yes, we absolutely think that's part of it, but it's not the only piece. You have to also create the demand pull through to either the end consumer or just before that. So we need either minimum content requirement standards or extended producer responsibility provisions that mandate, but in a way that reflects market-ready solutions, that there is actually going to be demand for the product, which then stimulates the upstream investment in identifying and growing solutions. So, Chris, I guess the short answer is yes, tax incentives have credits and otherwise have a role to play, but they're not the only policy incentive we would advocate.
So from the European perspective, what's your experience or the lessons that we should draw from what you've done for 10 plus years now in this space?
Well, I'm always a friend of providing incentives. It can be positive incentives or negative incentives. I'm more a fan of positive incentives, but indeed, in some cases, you need to work with negative incentives. So, for example, the last European Commission, just before it left its office, they made a law that would not prohibit or ban lightweight carrier bags, but every member state was imposed to make it expensive, so you would not be allowed to give away those bags for free. And that worked wonders. Within a few weeks, in retail, you had about 80% less of those lightweight carrier bags given to the customers, because at the end of the day, they needed to pay for it. Whether it's only 15 cents, doesn't make a difference. People started bringing their own bags. So it was easy to provide an incentive to reduce the usage of those lightweight carrier bags, which, by the way, are often the biggest problems when it comes to littering, the plastic you find on the beach. So this really works. If you want to provide an incentive to manufacturers, on the one hand, you have the extended producer responsibility, something which is really being worked on in Europe, and it's the producers of those plastic applications to the green dot, depending sustainable is recyclable in the tax positive or negative can indeed be a source of incentive for the producers.
Yeah. Also, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you now. Were you able to hear me? Was there a problem?
You broke up a little bit, but now I think you're on. Great.
Okay. I'm having problems with you now, but I think we'll give it a shot again, right?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So we know that the recycling rate of conventional plastics is pretty abysmal, around 9%, even though they've been in the market for 50, 60 years, something, maybe 70 years. And going forward, if we're developing a circular economy, what are the things we should be thinking about doing now so that we avoid those mistakes and that we've got, we're really closing the loop? Not to use a trademark term, but what else should we be thinking about, and what is the role for the federal government working with the states or other countries to deal with our problems also, and to the extent that we can, help with international efforts to try to get them to adopt more circular economy practices and using their renewable resources locally. So it's wide open. If you were in charge of everything.
Yeah, maybe I can speak to that, Chris. So when it comes to, I guess, providing those positive incentives that Hasse was talking about for small and medium-sized businesses that are in the consumer packaging goods industry, we have to think about ways to de-risk their investment in taking on new biopolymers in their process. And those types of changes to the equipment, changes to the processing of bioplastics is rather costly for a low-margin industry. So we need to think about ways that we can offer grants or low-interest loans from the federal government to basically help de-risk those investments. That way, once the established technologies kind of pan out in the market, they've already been proven and basically the models have been developed to basically incorporate these new bioplastics into the economy. So we can do this through some types of incentives for low investment loans, I believe.
I can give you kind of the framework at Closed Loop that we think about this. It's got 6 parts, again, without prescribing specific policies. We're still working through our own analysis of what's most effective, but we think no silver bullet. You've got to have all of these pieces. But if I think about recycling and composting together, I think the first is you start with definitions. So, nationwide, what is compostable and what is recyclable? And that's hard because there are 10,000 districts in the country, census tracts, I think at least, and not all collect or process recyclable the same way. So coming up with consistent definitions is helpful. Clear product design, we talked about avoiding look-alike, certification and consistent labeling and packaging and products. And then I think you hop over to the incentive and mandate piece of it for the last 3, which is policy that actually provides for required collection and processing of this material, for the market pull policy that requires that product and packaging producers actually use recycled and compostable or reusable content. There's a number of ways we can achieve that. Minimum content requirement, policy mandated, or it's a lot of leading brands are actually just setting these targets on their own. And also reusable materials. We don't talk enough about reusability, I think. We often jump to recyclability and compostability. And then to the last point, I think, and this is where my firm spends a bunch of time, but Evan just alluded to it, is capital. Just we need to provide more accessible, much more capital, accessible capital, whether it's market rate or below market rate, whether it's a subsidy, a tax credit, a cash grant. But it's not enough to just have capital available without having the infrastructure of standards, design, certification, and then local policy that actually makes the system work.
Also, did you want to comment on any international efforts that might be underway?
Yeah, I can give it a try. I hope you can hear me now better than before. Yes, I think it's indeed part of what Allison said is already happening in Europe. So indeed, the idea is to provide an incentive to add recycled content to your packaging, depending on what kind of packaging. The idea is to, of course, increase the recycled content over time. And the idea is to reduce the fees you need to pay depending on how much recycled content you are utilizing. This, of course, brings new issues. How do you measure the recycled content? How do you report the recycled content? And then we, as European Bioplastics, we are very hard trying to get the European Commission to put recycled content and bio-based content on the same level. So at the end of the day, if you can prove that your packaging has, for example, 45% renewable content and 30% recycled content, it should add up to 75% renewable recycled content, which should then be subtracted from the fee you pay. So indeed, there is enough maneuvering space to provide incentives like that. Of course, the implementation in some cases may be difficult, admittedly.
Evan, if I can put you on the spot for just a second, I'm curious if I'm a regular consumer, what's the next cool compostable product that I'm going to see in the grocery store or in the marketplace?
Well, one of the things that we're primarily focusing on is this effort for home compostable materials. And this is going to be for those materials that are very lightweight and often come contaminated with food products. Think about sachets, ketchup packets, single-use disposable things you get from takeout. And those have no recycling future, we think, simply because the mass of the material, it doesn't weigh enough. So there is no economic incentive to recycle these materials because they're hard to clean. They're typically constructed out of many layers of disparate types of plastic. And that's all necessary for the food packaging to be safe for the consumers. So you need to preserve the performance. However, those are the types of materials that are types of, I call article structures or geometries that are good targets for the compostable industry. And when it comes to recycling, you basically want to have incentivize those larger, heavier materials that are monomaterials, not mixed with other plastics. Provide some incentives for those kind of materials to be recycled also. So we don't want to be blending the disparate numbers, 1 through 7, to make a type of packaging. We want to make sure that it's a monomaterial for the recycling industry, because then again, it imparts higher value at the end of its life.
Chris, if I can jump in, we're seeing a lot more innovation we do early stage venture investing too in this sector. Historically, most of what we've seen that's compostable it comes from a corn derivative or a sugarcane derivative called bagasse. But we're seeing some more in cassava, and lately we've seen a couple of solutions that actually originate from lobster shells. That doesn't appease the vegan community, but it is a bio-based, arguably renewable resource, and actually they're being converted into a flexible plastic. So having a flexible bioplastic is harder to achieve than a rigid or mostly rigid bioplastic. So look out for lobster shell-based flexible bioplastics.
Well, we do have those plastic clamshell packaging that's really hard to open. So lobster shells, it makes sense. I guess I'll throw it open to everyone if they want to make a few comments, and I think we're going to move to Carolyn for questions shortly after that. Do you have any?
If I may, just one short comment about the home composting. It's a very big issue in Europe as well. The European Commission is actually pushing forward the idea of home composting, but they tend to forget that it's very difficult to standardize home composting, because depending on how you do it, you can be very successful or it does not work at all. I mean, you have everything in the range from home landfilling to somebody having one of those so-called hot bins that actually mimic the industrial composting facility, where you have a high temperature, a good turnover, very moist. And so it works very well in those, while in a home landfill, it will not work at all. So this standardization of home composting is very difficult. So you need to make up some minimum requirements that need to be fulfilled in order for the packaging, which is then certified to be home compostable, to actually work. Because there's nothing that we would dread more than the fact that people buy something which says it's home compostable, then they put it into their home compost, but just because they don't know how to really do it, it doesn't work. And then they say, oh, it's all a hoax, it doesn't work, even though it's because they don't know how to manage the home composting. So that is a very delicate issue where you need to try to make people understand if it's not really standardized, it can have its drawbacks.
Anybody else want to make a couple of comments before we go to more general questions from our audience?
I think only that we have a group of folks on this panel who all live in North America and Europe, and just a reminder for the folks on this call that let's call it household level composting and anaerobic digestion, which is breaking down your food or yard waste into biogas, is a set of technology that is used widely in the developing world for off-grid applications. So even though we just heard Hasso say that we do want to consider standardization in the countries that we live in, some of the physics and chemistry and biological breakdown of this is actually very, very old technology and a critical energy source for a lot of people in developing countries.
Excellent point. Carolyn, I think turning it over to you.
Great. Didn't know if Evan had a closing remark, but yeah, we have a question from Kevin from Ocean Conservancy, and I think we've touched a little bit, but maybe we can just summarize. He's saying, can the panelists talk about the potential need for standards of circular design to ensure recyclability?
Okay, I think the only thing I think I have to add here is that there are, in the United States, the Association of Plastic Recyclers is probably one of the farthest along in defining standards for recyclability for plastics, and they do it by resin type, PET versus polypropylene versus high-density polyethylene versus low-density polyethylene, et cetera. I'm admittedly not as familiar outside of BPI for standardization of and the ASTM for defining what is compostable and actually setting the rules around this. And I'd be curious what Hasso would have to say also about in Europe what we have. But I think we are in different phases depending on the material type of defining for plastics what a circular economy looks like. So work in progress.
Maybe I can pick up on a point that Evan already made earlier, that some packaging is so lightweight that no matter what the material is, no matter how technically recyclable it is, it's not going to be recycled because it's too lightweight, it's too difficult to sort out, to clean, or it's not economically worthwhile. So indeed, a simplified version of making things recyclable, say, if it's a heavy, rigid plastic, bioplastic, it should be a so-called drop-in bioplastic, so something that is chemically identical to the conventional ones, but that can be recycled. For example, biopolyethylene, bio-PET, bio-PE, all those normal conventional plastics that you know already exist in a bio version, meaning they're at least partly bio-based. In the case of polyethylene, for example, it's one of those which you have 100% bio-based from a company in Brazil called Braskem. They make the polyethylene from sugarcane, from bagasse. So that's possible. Then you have the PET, which at least to 30% can be bio-based as well, easily. So those are the kinds of plastics which can and should be recycled. Then again, as I said earlier, looking at different applications, biodegradability, compostability may make more sense. But then, of course, you need to create the right infrastructure in the countries. You need to have curbside collection of the different waste. You need to have separate waste collection, which is very important. If you throw everything into one bin and try to have it separated in a facility, you're going to have a lot of losses, which is unnecessary.
Okay, we do have another question. Was there, Evan, did you want to say anything to that panel or that question, or are you good?
Go for it. Yeah, you're fine.
Great. So the next question has to do with, so our current waste management system is kind of taxed in because of all the varying types of materials that we've introduced into our product stream, and our infrastructure hasn't necessarily kept up with managing all of it. So kind of interested to hear your thoughts on how maybe introducing a new material might add to that problem, or kind of your thoughts on how we could manage it.
Yeah, I can speak to that, Carolyn. And I'll give an example. In Philadelphia, between 2019 and this time last year, they have had a increase in tipping fees of 20-fold for their landfilling of materials. And this is due to a lot of reasons, not just COVID related. However, when we start to see very large increases in tipping fees, the national average is 5.2% per year, and that's actually quite a large annual increase for tipping fees. It provides those incentives for those other waste streams, for recycling and for composting. So I think it's going to be a little bit of reactionary to these increased tipping fees. Another good example is New York City is about $100 per ton for tipping fees, but South Carolina is somewhere in the $20 to $30 range. So it makes more sense economically for New York to ship its garbage by rail or by barge to South Carolina, which is an outsourcing of waste. Instead of it being across the country, it's across states to a lower income state. So there are economic incentives once the tipping fees increase to engage these other recycling streams.
If I go ahead, Allison.
Okay, Chris, I was just going to give a very sort of practical answer, Carolyn, to your question. But if you're a product designer or a brand thinking about introducing a new material or a new format, I would think about where your product literally geographically is likely to be consumed, and then survey the end-of-life infrastructure there. Is it likely to be collected? If it's not actually collected by a third party, are you putting the burden on your consumer to dispose? What is available for them? Is there end-of-life processing infrastructure available nearby? You may find that in some parts, potentially more progressive parts of the country, like California or the Northeast, where you have more infrastructure for handling recyclable or compostable waste, the answer is yes. And a lot of the countries no. So you might think about restricting distribution of your product, or potentially not introducing that material until there's actually infrastructure able to handle it. Sorry, Chris.
I was just going to say, going back a little ways, there were some Supreme Court decisions on the ability of municipalities to keep their resources, including their quote-unquote waste, and use it as a resource locally and turn it into other products or things like that. But now that waste is being barged and shipped and all over the world, it's much harder to make an economic case for something that is geographically defined, like, say, an industrial composting facility, which would be able to allow you to avoid, I don't know how much of the waste that New York might send to South Carolina, but probably 60% of this food scraps or organic waste that could be composted, turned into a valued added product, and avoid lots of methane. So it's also an artifact of the system that we've allowed to develop almost, as I said in the intro, kind of casually and non-intentionally. It's not a system. It's a responsibility that local governments have, and yet we've taken away most of their tools to really manage it comprehensively. Europe is obviously a very different situation, but
maybe coming back to the question that Carolyn said, what about if you introduce a new material? Just a few years or maybe a decade ago, a rather new material was introduced in the US. It was polylactic acid. It's a very versatile polymer that can be used in very different kinds of applications. And in Europe, we have the problem that there's just not enough of that material around to make it worthwhile to actively sort and collect it and recycle it. So the thing is, you have the hen and egg problem. On the one hand, you have an innovative material which works perfectly fine, but only in theory, because as long as there's not enough of the material going around, it cannot be recycled or will not be recycled. So there is always a difficult issue. How do you treat somebody introducing a new material to provide the incentive to introduce something innovative with specific and good features, and on the other hand, to avoid people coming up with all kinds of different polymers or mixtures, which at the end are not going to be recycled because maybe they're not even recyclable at all. So it's a very delicate and thin line you need to walk there. And I'm afraid also in Europe, it's not really yet working the way it should be.
Thanks, Hasso. One thing we had talked a lot about in our previous conversations leading up to this panel, again, is about infrastructure, because regardless, you're going to have to manage any material you put into a product. And so Evan pointed out really the lack of access to a lot of compostable infrastructure here in the U.S. And just wanted to, Evan, if you wanted to give us some stats on that and maybe some solutions to expanding our access to those types of infrastructures.
Sure, Carolyn. So I don't have the exact numbers for composting. As Allison alluded to earlier, there's only something like 200 or so active compost facilities in the United States. And most of those composting facilities don't want plastic packaging because the outcome of the composter, they're trying to turn a profit and make a product as well, is that the materials don't compost in the time frames that is expected. So if the materials don't degrade quick enough, then no one's going to accept them, which is why most of the composting facilities don't currently accept plastic packaging. And when it comes to access to these composting infrastructures, it's pretty low. It's less than 10%. I don't know exactly what that percentage is, but the average American doesn't have curbside pickup, doesn't have access to being within 20 miles of a composting facility, or they don't have any kind of private hauler to help with the delivery of that recycling waste stream.
Okay, and we also had a question about, so you're hearing a lot of companies that are coming out with recycled content goals and sustainability goals, and kind of, do bioplastics fit into that, or have companies approached any of you to kind of work on incorporating bioplastics into their new products? Just kind of interested to see if there's been any conversations on that.
Yeah, so I think the greatest credit probably goes to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is a European-based nonprofit organization that has really encouraged very successfully huge global corporations and increasingly governments and smaller companies to set ambitious targets. To answer your question, Carolyn, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation public commitment targets are oriented towards goals in 2025 and 2030 to make a certain percentage. They encourage at least 25% of packaging to be reusable, recyclable, or compostable. Bioplastics could fit into the compostability category. In theory, they could fit into the reusability category as well. So companies are looking at all three channels of achievement to satisfy their goals. And in particular, something I spend a lot of my time with, working with corporate partners at Closed Loop Partners, is trying to help these companies satisfy those targets with the reality that there actually isn't enough recycled content available to meet those targets. So they have to look into compostable solutions and they have to look into reusable solutions in order to satisfy those goals. And a lot of that simply has to do with what Hasso alluded to earlier, cheap fossil fuel resources, cheap natural gas and cheap oil makes the economics of recycling less attractive. So you don't actually have the incentive to buy non-virgin materials necessarily, which forces you to look into more innovative materials like a bioplastic.
Hasso, are you seeing any kind of those scenarios in Europe? Are companies making an effort to incorporate bioplastics into their product stream?
Yes, I see exactly the same thing. So Allison is completely right. A lot of our companies, even our member companies, are also members of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and they also pledge to be more sustainable. So indeed, we see a lot of companies coming to us to see whether there are more sustainable solutions to packaging than what they've been doing so far. And again, always depending on the markets they are trying to conquer, they have different, or we can provide them with different solutions. Unfortunately, when it comes to biodegradability or to compostability, it is a very heterogeneous market within Europe. So in some countries, you have specific applications which are allowed to be put into the bio bin. In others, it's not allowed. So it's very difficult to give a company some good recommendation what to use, because it always depends on which market they're trying to sell their products. So this is makes it very difficult. It would be much easier if you would have a homogeneous legislation all over Europe to see, okay, for this and this kind of application, you have this and this kind of solution which is accepted all over Europe. Unfortunately, today this is not the case. But we do have a lot of companies asking us for recommendations and ideas what they could do to substitute the packaging which they're using today.
Carolyn, could I jump in with a question? I'm wondering if any of the panelists have heard of any countries taking kind of the Ellen MacArthur pledge on the procurement end. So committing to buying only recycled or compostable material.
I don't know, but I imagine this is Googleable. If you search for Ellen MacArthur Foundation plastic economy commitments and look at the signatories, but I confess I don't know the answer to that. Chris Hasso, do you know if that's the case?
Well, I'm afraid I don't know. I know it's an issue. I know a lot of countries are working on green public procurement systems to indeed make public purchase of specific products to be more sustainable. And this also goes for packaging. But to my mind, as far as I know, it's not yet mandatory to do so. It's being, I don't know, advertised, it's being promoted, supported, but to my knowledge, it's not mandatory yet.
All right, well, that ends, we're kind of at the end of the hour here, so I don't know, I'll let you, Chris, if you have any closing remarks. Otherwise, thanks everyone for tuning in. And Chris, if you have any closing remarks, go ahead.
No, I don't. Thank you, panelists. It was great. It was a great discussion. I hope we can make some progress in this area fast.
Yep, thank you.
And I'll be putting my email in the chat. If anyone has watching has any follow-up questions or wants to get in touch with the panelists, feel free to shoot me an email. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mic on.
Okay, I've been sitting here because I was like, I don't know if it's